Hello and welcome back to Before the Shutter. I'm Harley. If you've not seen my videos before, this channel is all about art and photography. It's not really a gear channel, but I did anticipate that at some point someone's going to ask me what gear I use. So today I'm going to do a video which I can point back to in the future for basically answering any questions that anyone's got about what type of gear that I use. So to start us off with, I think the most important piece of equipment you need in a studio is a Jasmine. Hiya Jasmine. She's acting all camera shy because I just clap my hands to get the sound in sync. And beyond that, the most important piece of equipment is basically your eyes, your ears, your mouth and your brain. And I know that's a disappointing question. We will get into the actual gear shortly, but I just want to point out that the whole premise around the channel is that you don't need to have specific equipment and you don't need to have the very best skills in Photoshop. A lot of good photography really is being able to anticipate what's going to happen, predict where people are going to move, how they're going to move, how they're going to interact with other people. And with portraiture, a lot of it is helping people to build a confidence and feel comfortable and open in front of the camera, so when you do go to take that picture, they're not stiff or they're not putting on a what they think is a good face or a good pose, and really helping them through that. And you don't do that with your equipment, you do that with your people skills and you do that with your knowledge and experience. So I suppose that means we are going to have to get onto the equipment. I'm going to cut here, so I apologise, while I grab my stuff. Okay, so the first pieces of equipment I'm going to speak to you about are my cameras. And to start off with, I had a disposable camera, same as pretty much everyone. Then I moved on to a non-disposable film camera. This is like 20 years ago, so I'm showing my age a little bit. And over time I progressed onto digital cameras, you know, entry-level ones, point and shoots, that kind of thing. So it was only really with my degree that I knew what kind of camera I wanted to invest in. So the first of my cameras is the Sony A7II, and I chose that at the time because it was available for under £1,000 with a lens, and at that time it was the cheapest full frame camera available, which I knew would give me more dynamic range, better low light performance, the in-body stabilization, all the typical technical reasons for choosing a camera. And the crop sensor ones at the time just didn't have that same kind of flexibility and availability, especially for the price. Now, some of the other benefits for me was the size of the camera. I've actually had to attach a battery grip to the A7II because they are notoriously short battery lives, but with the battery grip I am able to pretty much do a full day of shooting for an event, especially because I use it as my backup camera now. My second camera is an A7 III, and I've chose that basically for the same reason anyone would choose the 3 over the 2. It meant that I could transfer all my lenses from one body to the next. It's got substantially better battery life, better dynamic range, better low light performance. It's got faster drive mode. The eye autofocus is fantastic. The size is very, very similar. There's a couple of other little bits and pieces that are tweaked, but overall it's pretty much the same as the A7II, but a lot better at all aspects of it. Now, I use both these cameras when I go and do an event, so whether it's a wedding or a corporate event or networking event, something like that. And the reason why I use 2 is because I like to use one as a backup just in case I have a problem with the second, but also because I don't want to be messing around changing lenses when something might be going on what's interesting. It allows me to jump from a long zoom to a standard zoom really, really quickly and easily. I thought I would just point out as well that on the A7 III I have got a leather wrist strap, and that's more for safety than anything really. Despite the size of the mirrorless bodies, they are still pretty cumbersome to carry around as just a walk around camera, especially when you've got a lens on there, because they are disproportionately large unless you're willing to sacrifice and buy a fixed pancake lens. Having that leather strap just gives me a little bit more security. I can hold on to it, I can let it dangle off my wrist while I'm talking to people, things like that. But also on both cameras I do keep a tripod plate and hooking points, and I can attach my cameras then to a harness, which is fantastic for events because it keeps them just towards your waistline. So the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is my lenses, and by no means these aren't the world's greatest lenses, but you get to a point where it's diminishing returns. And to be completely honest, the majority of your clients are not going to be pixel peeping like reviewers are doing on websites. I think get the best that you can within your budget, but as soon as you start getting to that point where you're spending, you know, $1,200, $1,500, £2,000 on a lens, the next step up, the £4,000 lens, is not twice as good. It's maybe 10, 15, 20% better at certain things. And to be honest, I've not really sold a picture. I've not sold my services on the quality of my lenses. People are a lot more concerned with the big picture, as it were. Saying that, my main lens, my go-to lens, is the Tamron 28-75. Anyone who shoots Sony pretty much knows this lens, I would have thought by now, and I know it's very, very widely used. And to be honest about this lens, there's a couple of downsides to it. It's not quite as fast on autofocus as the Sony. It's not quite as well built as the Sony, but it's like half the price, and it very, very rarely lets me down. I use it for events, I use it for portraiture, I use it for artwork. I just use it all the time. It very rarely leaves my camera body. The next one I've got is the 70-200 f4. Again, it's not the best that Sony does, and it's actually a lens that I very rarely use. I mainly keep it for weddings and events, just so that I can keep my distance and stay out of the way, use the zoom to get in close for those shots that I want to get, but I don't want to be stood right next to them. So for example, in a wedding, you don't want to be stood in the aisle of the church, but if you can go to the back of the church or to the side, then you can still get the good shots because there's plenty of focal length there to work with. The 2.8 will be a fantastic lens to have, but again, at double the price, it's just not worth it for me. I don't do enough of that kind of work to justify the price tag, and these are expensive enough as they are. I think I paid about 800 or 900 quid for that, which in the grand scheme of things is the same as what I paid for my camera body, and obviously I use that a lot more than this particular lens. So the next lens is Sony's 85mm 1.8. Again, not the best one, not the top of the range. There's the 1.2, the 1.4s, there's obviously the Sigmas and the Tamrons and all the different brands you can get, but this is probably my favourite lens. It's extremely sharp, it's got fantastic picture quality, it's just very, very pleasing. The only issue I've got with this lens really is that the minimum focus distance is quite long. I think it's somewhere around 1 meter. So whilst it's fantastic for portraits and close-up portraits, it's actually quite hard to get very close-up portraits with this. Whereas with some of the 85mm, they have a ½ meter or a 50 centimeter minimum focus distance, which just means you can get a lot more of your subject to fill the frame. Whereas with this, you kind of have to crop down to get that same effect. Now, I think I paid about 400 quid for this. For £400, this is, I believe, by far the best buy for a Sony lens. Things like the speed of focus, the clarity, the fact it's got the little programmable button on the side, they're all such major benefits that I'd really struggle to justify doubling my budget just for this particular focal length. Again, I use it a lot, but still not as much as my 28-75 and the next lens I'm about to show you. It is like a plasticide metal body. I'm not entirely certain, but it feels fantastic. It's honestly very chuffed with that. And the last lens I wanted to show you is basically just the Nifty 50. It's the Sony 50mm 1.8, and again, same as with the 85, same as with the 70-200, far from being the top of the range. I think the 1.2's just come out, the GM, but the clarity, the sharpness, speed of operation, the size, they're all fantastic, and you can pick these up for like 100, 150 quid. And I have no problems whatsoever printing and producing images from this and submitting them to clients, because yeah, if you pick up PP, you're going to notice whatever kind of flaws it's got. No doubt it's pretty soft in the corners, like all 1.8s in this kind of price range. But aside from the fact that the focus is a bit on the slow side and a little bit on the noisy side, to justify 5, 6, 7 times the cost, even 10 times the cost for something like the GM, it's just not worth it. These are fantastic, fantastic lenses. Okay, so that's kind of like the cameras and the lenses out of the way. Like I said, I'm not doing a big in-depth review. I'm just trying to point out what I use and really highlight that you don't need the very top of the range stuff to be successful and make money as a photographer, and especially as an artist. But I think it's going to be a question that people have regardless. And I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent, so we'll go on to some of the smaller stuff, that being flashes and controllers. So I've just got pretty standard Sony DSLR2 infrared remote. It's fine, it does what a remote's supposed to do: shutter, timed release, video controls, zoom controls if you've got a motorized lens or a bridge camera, something like that. Really good, works pretty decent distance, works pretty decent angles. I use that quite a lot in my artwork. Then I've got my flash controllers. The first one is the Godox X1TS. You can see me reading it as I'm doing this. Fantastic starter controller. It's cumbersome changing all the settings because it's just got 3 buttons, a wheel and a tiny little screen. So it's not something that I would use in the studio. But in the rare situation where maybe I wanted to use 2 cameras in the studio with 2 different focal lengths, it means that I can set up both cameras with controllers, and this being a little bit less handy to change settings on is not that big of a deal, because I'd just be copying them over from my main one. And the main one is the XPro-s. This is a lot better for ease of control and changing settings and setting up multiple groups. So that's something I can use quite often in the studio, where maybe I've got 3 or 4 different lights set up and I want different settings for each one, or different timings for each one, whatever it might be. This is a lot better choice for doing that. And again, these are cheap. Like the XT1 you can get for like 20-25 quid, something like that, and the Pro-s, I think I paid like 35 for mine from Amazon warehouse. Then I've got 2 Godox V862Ss, and these are pretty much the best Hotshoe flashes I think you can get for less than 200 quid, 300 quid. The reason I say that is because they're powerful. They have a GN of 60, so that's pretty decent. I know you can get up like 63, 65s and possibly higher, but the actual output is really, really nice. It's pretty consistent with colouring. It's fast recharge, really useful screen, nice buttons, movable head, all the usual stuff that you get with a Hotshoe, but the build quality is fantastic. The game changer for me is the lithium ion rechargeable battery that is included in it. AA's are fine, but you burn through them really, really quickly. Rechargeable AA's are fine, but they do have a tendency to wear out quite quickly and they take a long time to charge, whereas these, you know, I can bang them on charge for 20-30 minutes and I'm good for 100 shots or something like that, which is fantastic. Plus, by having 2 of them, I can pretty much count on uniformity between exposure settings and flash settings, which is really good, and I can run them off the Godox triggers so they don't need to be attached to the camera. They do TTL both attached to the camera and through the controllers, which is really, really good. It makes life a lot easier if you're dealing with fast moving complex setups in the studio, like kids and things, where they're not going to stand exactly where you want them to be all the time and where you've done your lighting setups for. So that's good. But they are my secondary lighting. I use them on the camera for events and stuff, but in the studio the secondary lighting, because they're powerful enough to do a little bit of fill or to do some background work with. My main flash, however, is this one over here. I'll probably just walk over and get it. I've probably cut that because it was embarrassing how long it took me to get it off that stand. But this is the Godox AD400 Pro. It's battery rechargeable, which is fantastic because I do outdoor shoots as well, so this is fine for using as fill light. The 400's not necessarily the most powerful by any means, and using it to try and overpower the sun, as they say, is not what it's really made for. But I don't tend to go for that look. I prefer a much more natural look, so I just use this for fill more than anything. Whereas in the studio, it's fine. I can shoot all day with this. The battery lasts like 300, 400 plus shots, more than that at full power. And it's more than powerful enough to do a small setup. Now, if I need a bigger setup, that's where I would turn to hiring stuff or using whatever the studio has got in place already, because in all honesty, it's not worth the money of buying a massive setup. Admittedly, there's going to be, you know, photographers out there who tell you need 1000-watt strobes and they need to be pro photo, but again, in my experience, I've been making money and I've been making work perfectly fine with this, which is around £500 to £600 on UK markets, just depending on what the demand's like. I think I actually paid about 400 for mine, so you know, you keep an eye out and you can get a really good deal on them. And to be honest, not let me down, not really felt that I needed more. I will get a 600 at one point, but I'm waiting for the prices to settle on them before I do, and that's mainly because I'd like an additional strobe, and if I'm going to get an additional strobe, I might as well go one step up and have more than what I actually need. So some of the good things about the Godox is obviously the rechargeable battery, which we've mentioned, but also the modelling light. It's got a 30-watt LED modelling light, which is really good for setup. It's got two different mounting styles, so it's got a Bowens mount and it's got, I think it's a Godox mount, I'm not entirely certain. It's got a nice clear screen, easy to use buttons, easy to use menus. It's TTL as well, same as everything else, so again good for the studio when it's hard work trying to manage your subjects into a certain place within the studio. But because it's Godox, it's compatible with all my equipment basically. And that is pretty much what I would consider what anyone would ever need to be a freelance photographer. Yeah, there's going to be situations where you need additional equipment, you know, more lights, more cameras, better lights, better cameras, whatever it might be. But for the day-to-day stuff, your own personal artwork, portraits in a small studio or headshots, things like that, corporate events and small-scale weddings, there's more than enough there for people to make a living off it and make a profit. If I needed anything higher than what I've got, I'd consider, is it worth buying? Is it going to, you know, make my work better? Is it going to make my life easier? And if I can pay it off within a reasonable amount of time in terms of what I lose in profit from spending, then yeah, I might buy it. But the majority of the time, I'd actually look into hiring or borrowing if the studio has got it, just to complete that one job and probably never use it again. It's like going back to the 70-200. It's not often that I use that lens, but by having it on hand, it's really useful in those kind of situations where I want to try something with it, or it'll give me that extra reach that I do need. It's not something that I would hire because it being there is a bit of a safety net for those situations where maybe I didn't get to see the location first, so it's bigger than I anticipated. Whereas if I were to go out and buy, say, a 600mm lens, I'm never going to use that. I have very, very little use case for 200mm, so 600 is a huge investment and it's just not worth it to me. Now, if you're a sports photographer and you work in a football match, you might be thinking, well, 600mm is like the minimum that I would ever buy because I need to see from one side of the pitch to the other. And that's where the specialism of that particular type of photography does need that kind of thing. Whereas for me, and for a lot of people out there who are only really interested in portraiture, a 600mm lens is an extravagant expenditure that I would never even hire, let alone buy. So I suppose that brings us somewhere to the end, and I wanted to round it up really with how does this fit into my artwork, because art doesn't generally focus on the gear or the equipment of the photographer who's making it, and it's very rare that you hear conceptual art photographers talking about cameras. Yeah, they'll talk about the process maybe, or how they've created an image and where they were drawn inspiration from, but rarely do they speak about their actual equipment. Now, you do get the occasional one, so that's not a blanket statement, but generally it's more about their inspiration than their technique. So for me, just having the A7III and the 50 plus the 2875 and the Hotshoes, that's pretty much everything that I use in my art. And that's because I understand them tools intimately. I know how to get it to react to the way that I want it to. I know how these lenses look. I understand the limitations, and I understand what the framing of the shot is going to be without necessarily having to spend a lot of time constantly checking behind the camera. So I mentioned the Hotshoes over the main light. That's mainly because I prefer having the flexibility and ease of use of the Hotshoes, rather than taking the big light and the stand and a softbox and all that kind of thing, trying to make it fit into an environment and trying to get that to light naturally. I'd much prefer to use as much natural light as I can and use the Hotshoes as fill or as an overriding colour. I'll often gel these, which you'll see in some of my artwork on the website, and at some point I'll talk about it on YouTube, but I can then pop them onto a little stand which literally just goes onto the bottom there. It's just a little flat stand, and I can move them around the scene to anywhere I want them to go without having to juggle all the equipment that goes with it. So I'll use the gels mainly to add a splash of colour, but sometimes if I've got natural light and artificial light, I'll use it to correct the balance between the two. Having the ability to control this light just by moving the head of the zoom is often enough to make it a lot more useful. Unlike with the main strobe, where you kind of have to buy light modifiers to get the look that you want. With the Hotshoes, you can change the zoom inside, which will change the light, but also you can get away with just like wrapping a piece of card around it to turn it into a snoot or something like that. And really that's kind of the point of why I enjoy doing art photography. It's a lot more about finding new ways to do things within the environment and within the setup that you're doing. It's not about having the best gear. And if you're wanting to be a professional photographer or portrait artist or an artist in general, you don't, as you can see here, hopefully you don't have to have the very best equipment. Yes, I'm lucky in that I've got above average equipment in many cases, but my most used stuff is not because it's the most expensive, but because it's the most user friendly and it's the most efficient at what I'm doing at that moment in time. So that's why an A7III, a 2875, a 50 and a couple of Hotshoes is basically all I need to do the majority of my work. So that's the video. It's probably the only time I'll go into talking about what gear I use and what gear I recommend. Everything here is stuff I would recommend, and you know, I use it day in, day out, and it's all fantastic. But the premise of the channel is now to focus on talking about what makes good photography and discussions around the ideologies and theories of photography which influence different movements over history and how that's brought us to where we are right now, and hopefully how we can learn from that to progress photography even further and keep it relevant and keep it on the edge of creative arts. I should have said cutting edge, but you get the point. So if you liked this video, you might not like the rest of the channel because it's not about this, but if you can put up with me for like half an hour or however long I've been speaking for now, you might be able to put up with me for my podcast and YouTube videos. Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down, share, all that kind of YouTube stuff. You know what to do. It's been here for long enough. Thank you very much, and I'll see you soon. And Jasmine's really got bored now.